My name is Margaret Harrow. Most people just call me Maggie. And I never thought I'd hear the words mentally unfit applied to me in a legal document, let alone signed, filed, and whispered behind my back like gospel truth. But that's exactly what happened. And the worst part, it wasn't some stranger or rival or bitter acquaintance who did it. It was my daughter-in-law, the woman my son married, the woman I had once welcomed into my home, my family, and foolishly my trust. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because what I'm about to tell you is how one lie almost stripped me of everything, and how one truth brought it all back with interest. It started on a Wednesday. I remember the exact day because I had just baked a blackberry pie and was cooling it on the windowsill like something out of an old movie. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon and browned butter. That kind of smell that makes you feel like everything is all right in the world. And then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My son Daniel usually texted before coming over. But there he was standing on the porch next to her. Emily, my daughter-in-law. She had that tight smile on her face, the one that didn't touch her eyes. The kind of smile that always made me feel like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said, stepping forward. Emily didn't speak, just clutched her purse tighter. I didn't know it yet, but in that purse was the beginning of the lie. They sat me down in the living room. Daniel kept wringing his hands. Emily kept looking at her phone. Finally, she said it. "We've been worried about you, Margaret. Some of the things you've said lately, and the way you've been acting." I laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. Acting. She pulled a folded document from her bag and laid it on the coffee table like a priest delivering last rites. It was a petition, an actual legal petition. Emily had filed paperwork to have me evaluated for mental competency. Daniel's signature was on it too. I remember feeling cold. Not just emotionally, but physically. My hands went numb. I could still hear the wind chimes outside, but they sounded like bells at a funeral. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being erased. Emily said it was just a precaution, that the court would send someone to evaluate me, and if I was fine, nothing would come of it. But I wasn't a fool. I'd worked as a paralegal for nearly 4 decades. I knew what guardianship petitions looked like, and I knew how often they were weaponized. A single note from the right doctor, a single report from a biased evaluator, a few carefully planted incidents, forgotten appointments, misplaced mail, maybe even a neighbor who thought I looked confused, and I could be legally declared incapable of managing my own life. They didn't need to prove I was crazy. They just needed to prove I was no longer sharp enough to say no. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, the same old oak desk I'd used to review contracts and draft motions for decades. I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out my journal. Not the flowery kind. This one was plain black, leather-bound and indexed by date. I'd kept it for years. I recorded everything: appointments, conversations, receipts, feelings, sometimes even dreams. And then I remembered something. Emily once teased me about how old school my journaling habit was. She called it paranoid. "Why not just use your phone like everyone else?" she said. Now I understood. She didn't want records. She wanted silence. But I had a paper trail, and it was time to start building it like a wall. The next morning, a woman arrived. Court-appointed. Clipboard in hand, overly cheerful, asking me to spell the date, name the president, and draw a clock. It was insulting, but I smiled. Played along. Even offered her tea. She stayed an hour. Took notes. Frowned a few times when I asked about her credentials. She left without saying anything. 2 days later, I received notice that a temporary guardianship hearing had been scheduled. Daniel and Emily were requesting control of my medical and financial decisions for my safety. They even listed my home as an asset to be protected. My name was on that deed. But if I didn't act soon, it wouldn't matter. Because if the court believed their lies, that house wouldn't belong to me anymore. Not legally, not emotionally, not even in memory. That night, I didn't cry. I photocopied everything. The journal entries, the bills I'd paid on time, the texts I'd exchanged with friends, the emails I'd written, clear, organized, thoughtful. And I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 6 years. Benjamin Lowe. He used to be a senior attorney at the firm where I worked. He retired a year before I did. Moved to the coast. Loved fishing and reading and never checking his voicemail. But when he picked up, his voice was the same. Margaret Harrow, he said. Haven't heard that name in a long time. I need your help, Ben, I said. There was a pause. Who's trying to screw you over? And just like that, the fight began. Ben Lowe showed up 2 days later wearing a windbreaker and boat shoes, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it hadn't seen the inside of a courtroom in years. He still had the same no-nonsense gait, the same sharp eyes that didn't miss a flicker of doubt. When he stepped into my house, he didn't comment on the smell of blackberry pie or the tea I had steeped. He just looked at the documents I handed him and said, "Well, they didn't even try to be subtle, did they?" I sat down across from him. "What do you think?" He shook his head slowly. "I think your daughter-in-law made a rookie mistake. And your son." He paused. Either he's in way over his head or he's grown spineless. I didn't say anything, because I knew which it was. Daniel had always been kind. A little slow to speak up, maybe, but kind. When his father passed away from heart failure, Daniel was just 28. I leaned on him more than I should have. Maybe he leaned on me too. But Emily, she came into his life like a bright light and slowly dimmed every room she entered. It started with small things. Asking Daniel to speak for both of them, telling me what I should wear to a dinner party to blend in, talking over me when I tried to offer parenting advice for their new baby. And then it escalated like erosion, not a landslide. Bit by bit, she removed me from decisions. From Daniel's ear, from their lives, until one day I realized I didn't know what school my grandson went to, what allergies he had, or whether he still called me Grandma. Now she was trying to make sure I didn't own my name either. Ben flipped through the paperwork. She used a general practitioner with no psychiatric license to sign this medical concern for me. That's our first crack. I nodded. I've got records, emails, a full daily log for the past 18 months. He looked up. You kept all that? I kept everything, I said. Because I worked with women like Emily for 40 years. People who smile and say, "Just looking out for you," while they dig a legal grave behind your back. He smiled just a little. Then we don't just defend, we go on offense. The hearing was in 9 days. 9 days to prepare for a battle that would determine whether I was free or a prisoner in my own life. Ben advised me not to confront Daniel or Emily. Let them feel comfortable. Keep your mind sharp and your paper trail sharper. I followed every word. But that didn't stop Emily. 3 days before the hearing, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Harrow," the woman said. "This is Sandra with Autumn Hills Assisted Living. We're confirming your suite reservation for the 19th. My blood ran cold. "I didn't make any reservation," I replied. "Oh, your guardian initiated the request." Emily Harrow said everything was approved by court. Court hadn't ruled yet, and she was already trying to move me into a home. The next morning, Emily showed up on my porch again. No Daniel this time. She wore beige, her power color. She said it made her feel centered. "Maggie," she said, "I just wanted to talk." Woman to woman. I didn't open the screen door. I know this is scary, but I promise once this is settled, you'll feel relieved. Someone else taking care of bills, groceries, all of it. You won't have to think so hard. I tilted my head. "You're trying to convince me I should be grateful you're stealing my life." She blinked. "No one's stealing anything. You've been through a lot. Maybe you don't realize how overwhelmed you are." I smiled. "I kept track of every word you just said. You should assume I record everything now, including this conversation." For the first time, I saw the corners of her mouth twitch. Not a smile. A flinch. Then she turned and walked away. And I made another journal entry. Ben came by again that evening. He had printed out pages from Emily's social media. A private Facebook post from 3 months ago where she joked about how some people just don't know when to sign over the house and sit down. He highlighted it. "We'll use this. Shows motive." Then he handed me a printout of court precedent. A woman in Nevada had her guardianship reversed because her accuser submitted paperwork without full disclosure of medical history. "Your case is stronger than hers," Ben said. But I could tell he was still worried. This kind of accusation, even disproven, leaves a scar. 2 nights before the hearing, Daniel called. I didn't answer, so he came by. I let him in against Ben's advice. He looked tired. Not just tired, withered. Mom, he said, can we just talk? I nodded. He sat down, looked around the living room like it was unfamiliar. Like it hadn't been his childhood fortress of forts and cookies and safety. She said you were forgetting things. Getting angry. Confused. She made it sound like you weren't okay. And you believed her. He swallowed. I don't know what to believe. You seem fine now, but I pointed to my file folders stacked neatly in the corner. I don't need to seem fine, Daniel. I am fine. I've got years of documentation, legal advice, psychological evaluations from certified professionals. And I'm not fighting for your approval anymore. I'm fighting for my freedom. His face crumpled just slightly. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. Then why didn't you stop it? No answer, only silence. He left not long after, and I didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because this wasn't the end. It was the preface to a courtroom I planned to walk into, eyes, clear voice, steady truth on my side. And Emily, she had no idea that I had something she could never fake: credibility. I arrived at the courthouse just after sunrise. The building was still quiet. The marble floors freshly waxed, the air inside cool and sterile. I always hated the artificial calm of courthouses, the way they tried to mute the chaos that passed through their doors every day. Ben met me at the bench outside Department 3B. He wore a suit for the first time in years, navy like mine, as if we were heading into battle in uniform. You look ready, he said. I'm not the one who should be nervous, I replied. We entered the room together. And across the aisle, Emily sat with her attorney, some young man with a pocket square and the overconfidence of someone who thought civility was weakness. She didn't look at me, but I looked at her, and I saw something new behind her eyes: worry. The judge, a woman named Corin Ellison, was known for being sharp, skeptical, and utterly immune to flattery. I'd worked under lawyers who trembled in front of her, not because she raised her voice, but because she never once wasted a word. Exactly the kind of judge I needed. The case was simple in format, messy in substance. Emily and Daniel were petitioning for limited guardianship based on observed cognitive decline and increasing irrational behavior. Emily's lawyer began with his opening statement, calm, composed, and full of carefully chosen half-truths. He described my deteriorating memory, referencing an incident where I'd left the stove on and forgotten to attend a doctor's appointment. Both lies. I had documentation to prove it, but he made them sound real. The trick wasn't in what he said, it was in how easily it might be believed. I was 74, widowed, living alone. To the court, I looked like a narrative waiting to be written, but they hadn't read my chapters yet. Ben rose and opened with just one sentence. My client is here not because she is mentally unfit, but because she is inconvenient. Then he sat down. The silence that followed echoed like thunder. The judge called Emily to the stand. I studied her as she walked up. Her posture was perfect, her voice poised. She spoke of deep concern and long-term patterns. She cried once. Not convincingly, but enough for the courtroom to shift in her favor for a moment. She cited my paranoia, my obsession with note-taking, and even claimed I accused her of planting microphones. That last one made me raise an eyebrow, because I'd never said it aloud, only written it in my journal, which meant she'd been reading it. Ben caught it too. He scribbled something and passed me a note. She broke into your journal. Use it. I tucked that away. The time wasn't right yet. Next came the medical witness, Dr. Leonard Green, a general physician Emily had used for her petition. I knew his name. I'd researched him. Ben began the cross-examination gently. Doctor, are you board certified in geriatric psychiatry? No, I'm a general practitioner. So you're not trained to assess long-term cognitive decline. Well, I do see elderly patients. Yes, but are you licensed to perform formal mental competency evaluations? He hesitated. No. Ben nodded. So your letter submitted as evidence was based on a single visit and no clinical testing. That's correct. Thank you. No further questions. My turn. I took the stand with slow, measured steps. Not dramatic. just deliberate. The court needed to see that I was steady, composed, alive in every mental faculty. Ben asked me simple questions first: my name, age, background in law. Then he handed me a folder. Do you recognize this? I opened it. My journal. Yes, this is my personal record. Dated, indexed, annotated. Can you describe the contents? Daily reflections, financial records, notes from meetings, lists of appointments, medication logs, conversations. Everything I thought might one day be used against me. The judge leaned forward slightly. Ben smiled. And have you, in the past 18 months, missed any critical appointments? No. I have receipts and confirmation emails for every one. Did you leave your stove on? No. I have a video timestamp from my security system proving otherwise. He paused. Mrs. Harrow, did you ever accuse your daughter-in-law of planting microphones in your home? No. Are you aware she testified that you did? Yes. Which is curious, because I only wrote that suspicion in my journal. Ben turned to the judge. Your Honor, unless Ms. Harrow confided this thought aloud, the only possible source of that claim is her private journal, meaning the petitioner read it without permission. The courtroom murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. Min. Harrow, can you confirm this journal was kept in a secure location? Yes. My bedroom drawer. Locked. Have you ever shared its contents with Miss Harrow? Never. The judge turned to Emily. Counselor, I expect a response from your client regarding this potential breach. Her attorney shifted, whispered to Emily. She turned pale, and for the first time in this whole performance, she looked small. Ben closed with quiet force. This case is not about mental decline. It is about manipulation. A woman who saw an opportunity to gain control over another's life and legacy, and thought age was the only permission she needed to try. He sat down, and I waited. The judge didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, in a voice that made no room for misinterpretation, petition denied. A full sentence. 2 words. But in that moment they were a symphony. Emily's shoulders slumped. Her lawyer exhaled. Daniel stared at his hands. And me, I didn't smile. I just breathed. We walked out of the courtroom into a hallway full of silence. Ben patted my arm. You won, Maggie. I didn't just win, I said. I survived their rewrite of my story, and I wasn't going to let anyone else hold the pen ever again. The sun was high by the time we stepped out of the courthouse, but I barely noticed the warmth. Everything around me felt muted, like the world was recovering from a held breath. I wasn't elated. I wasn't triumphant. I was free. And that, I realized, is a very quiet kind of victory. Ben walked beside me in silence. He didn't offer congratulations, just handed me a manila envelope and said, inside is the transcript, the ruling and certified court records. Keep them somewhere safe, just in case she tries again. I nodded and clutched the envelope tight. Not because I thought Emily would return with more lies, but because I knew women like her never left empty-handed. We parted outside the building. I drove home alone. The house felt different. Same walls, same rooms. But the energy had shifted. I could finally sit in my own living room without wondering if someone had installed a camera. I could drink tea at the kitchen table without worrying that it might be used as evidence of decline. Still, I didn't unpack my folders or file the court documents away just yet. Because I wasn't done. There was one last thing I needed to do. The next morning, I drafted a formal letter to my financial advisor. I updated my will, removed Daniel and Emily from every clause, left the bulk of my estate modest but comfortable to a nonprofit legal fund for elder abuse victims. The rest, including the house, would go to an old friend who had been checking on me throughout this entire ordeal, slipping notes under the door and soup into my freezer. Her name was Helen. We'd played bridge together for 20 years. She never once questioned my memory, only asked how I was really doing. That kind of loyalty deserves more than thank yous. It deserves legacy. Later that day, Daniel came by, alone again. No Emily in sight. He stood on the porch like a boy who had broken something valuable, but couldn't find the pieces to fix it. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. I wanted to apologize. He said, "Do you want to be forgiven?" I asked. Or do you want to feel less guilty? He flinched. I didn't think it would go that far. I thought she just wanted peace of mind. I laughed cold and quiet. No, Danielle. She wanted power. And you handed her the keys. He looked down at his shoes. She's leaving. I told her I can't live with someone who lies like that. I nodded slowly. And yet you were willing to believe her over your own mother. I know, he said. I know I messed up. I should have asked you directly. I should have trusted you. You didn't even call me when she started the paperwork, I said. You let her decide the story. I was scared, he said softly. And I was alone. He blinked, tears pooling. Can I come in? I stepped aside just enough to make it clear I hadn't said yes. Come in, I said finally. But this isn't a reset. This is just the beginning of a very long explanation. We sat in silence for a while. He looked around the house like he was seeing it for the first time. The framed photos, the piano, the lace doilies on the armrests. None of it had changed. Only he had. I poured us tea. He sipped. Then he asked, was there any truth to what she said? About paranoia? About the journal? I smiled. Keeping records isn't paranoia, Daniel. It's protection. You can't imagine how quickly women like me disappear in the system when no one's watching. One word from the wrong person and you lose your home, your name, your decisions. He nodded. I continued. The journal wasn't for her. It wasn't even for me. It was for the court. For the moment someone tried to rewrite my truth. He sat back. I didn't know you were still that sharp. And that more than anything stung. Not because it wasn't true, but because he had stopped expecting it to be. Over the next hour we talked. I didn't forgive him. Not yet. But I let him listen. Let him sit in the guilt, in the questions, in the silence between each word. That's how trust begins to grow back. Not with declarations, but with discipline. He left just before sunset. No hug, no promises, just a quiet, thank you for not slamming the door. And my response, you don't thank people for basic decency, Daniel. You match it. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened a new journal. The first page read, just because someone tries to steal your mind doesn't mean they can claim your spirit. And under it, I added, let them underestimate you. That's when you become most dangerous. I closed the book, turned off the light, and for the first time in weeks slept deeply. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had defended what was mine, and no one was going to take it again. A week passed, then another, and in that quiet space where conflict had once lived, I started to rebuild something much harder than a legal defense. My rhythm. When people think about victory, they imagine parades, speeches, grand finales. But sometimes the most powerful form of winning is relearning how to water your plants without looking over your shoulder. I resumed my routines. Morning tea by the window, letters to Helen, walks in the garden. Not because I was trying to prove anything anymore, but because these were mine. And I refused to let fear leave space in my life. One afternoon, I received a letter, handwritten, neat, narrow strokes. It was from Emily. Inside was a single page. I realize now what I did was unforgivable. I thought I was helping. Maybe I was helping myself. Either way, I failed you. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I owe you this. I won't interfere again. No excuses. No pleas. Just a confession on paper. It felt anticlimactic, but also necessary. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a surrender. I folded it and tucked it into the back of my journal. Not out of sentiment, but for the record. Every chapter had its own proof. 2 days later, my landline rang. I knew the number. Autumn Hills Assisted Living. The same place Emily had tried to send me. I answered. Mrs. Harrow. This is Janine from the administrative office. I just wanted to call and apologize for the confusion earlier this month. We've removed the pending reservation. I paused. I never made that reservation. A beat of silence. I know, but we wanted you to know the person who submitted it, Emily Harrow, is no longer allowed to initiate applications on anyone's behalf. I smiled. Thank you. She hesitated. If I may, we've had 3 women in the past year go through similar situations. Would you be willing to speak at our community education night next month? I raised an eyebrow. Speak. Yes. About what happened. How you protected yourself. It might help others. I didn't answer right away. But the thought of standing in front of a room full of women like me, women who had been silenced, doubted, brushed aside, it stirred something. Not anger, not revenge, but clarity. I agreed. And that night, I sat down and began outlining my story. Not for court this time, but for those who still had time to rewrite theirs. It was the first time I realized my voice wasn't just for defense. It could be a weapon, a shield, a map. The day of the community talk arrived quietly. Helen came with me. There were about 30 people in the room, mostly women, a few men, some with walkers, some with perfect posture, all with eyes that had seen more than their mouths would ever admit. I stood at the front and cleared my throat. My name is Margaret Harrow, I began. And someone I loved tried to declare me mentally unfit so they could control what I owned. The room went still. But the truth is, I've never been sharper in my life. And the more they tried to erase me, the more I documented. I told them about the petition, the locked drawer, the journal, the hearing, and then I said the part I hadn't even fully realized until that moment. They didn't underestimate me because I was old. They underestimated me because I was quiet. And when I finished, the room was silent again. Only this time, it wasn't fear. It was power. Dozens of women sitting up straighter. One even wiped her eyes. I stepped off the stage and returned to my seat. And Helen leaned over and whispered, "You didn't just win your case, Maggie. You reclaimed something none of them knew you lost." "What?" "Your story." That night, I stood in front of my mirror, the one I'd avoided for a long time, and I looked not for wrinkles or signs of decline, but for proof of who I still was. I saw a woman who had built her life carefully, lost her husband early, raised a son alone, buried the silence of loneliness beneath books and bridge games, and then when threatened rose without screaming. Because power doesn't always yell, sometimes it just keeps receipts. There would be more chapters ahead. I knew that. Life doesn't end when the court closes its book. But now, for the first time in a long time, I felt something stronger than safety. I felt ready for anything. Autumn turned to winter, and the trees outside my window shed their leaves with the same quiet certainty I had come to admire in older women. There's a kind of grace in aging that no one warns you about. Not the wrinkles or the stiff joints, but the slow sharpening of sight, not just what you see, but how you see. I began to see clearly now not just what Emily had done, but why. And even harder, I began to see my role in letting it happen. I don't mean I deserved it, but somewhere between the quiet holidays and missed calls, I had stopped showing Daniel who I was. I had let myself become an idea in his mind, a soft, aging shadow that drifted around the edge of his life. I had let silence replace connection, let convenience become comfort, let my independence become invisibility. And when I vanished from his narrative, someone else stepped in to write my lines. That's how women like Emily rise, not by overpowering us, but by walking into the empty spaces we leave behind. I didn't reach out to Daniel again, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to see whether he'd come back because he wanted to, not because he was told to. One day, weeks after the court hearing, he called. I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Daniel, I was wondering if we could talk. Not about Emily, just about us." I didn't say yes, but I didn't hang up either. He came by that Saturday. No agenda, no script, just a single Tupperware dish in his hands. "I made your beef stew," he said. "The one with too much rosemary." I smiled. "You always said it tasted like soap." He shrugged. "Guess I missed the soap." We sat in the kitchen and ate in near silence. Then he asked, "Do you hate me?" "No," I said, "but I don't trust you. Not yet." "That's fair." He looked down at his bowl. "It's strange. Emily made me believe I was being a good son, that I was protecting you. She made you feel like a man," I said, "but she did it by making me smaller." His jaw tensed. "I see it now," he said. "I just wish I had seen it then." He started coming by once a week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit and listen. He didn't try to fix things, didn't make grand gestures. He just showed up. And I realized something else. Rebuilding trust doesn't begin with forgiveness. It begins with consistency. A few weeks later, I received a letter from a woman named Sharon. She'd been at the talk I gave at Autumn Hills. She wrote, "My daughter has been quietly transferring assets into her name. I thought I was imagining it until I heard you speak. I've started documenting everything. Thank you for giving me back my clarity." I sat with that letter for a long time. Because sometimes the victory isn't just yours. Sometimes it ripples. And I finally understood why Ben had said yes when I called him. Not just to help me, but because these cases, they multiply in silence. And every woman who speaks cuts through that silence. That spring, I started writing a small column in the community newsletter, Guarding Your Golden Years. Notes from a Legal Mind. Catchy, I know. Each week I'd tackle one question: how to protect your home, how to assign power of attorney, what signs to watch for when family starts asking for access. People started writing in. Some asked about money. Others shared secrets, whispers of children trying to get them into assisted living prematurely, or concerned nephews who suddenly cared about grandma's investments. I didn't offer therapy, I offered tools. And each week I ended the column the same way. Just because you're older doesn't mean you're over. You're not fragile. You're valuable. And value deserves to be protected. One evening after dropping off groceries, Daniel sat with me on the back porch. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden line across the fence. "Do you ever regret not fighting her sooner?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. "I regret not noticing the erosion," I said. "But once I saw it, I fought exactly when I was ready." He nodded. "I'm sorry I wasn't beside you." "You weren't the one I needed to beat?" I said. "You were just collateral." He looked down. "What happens now?" I took a deep breath. "Now, you earn your way back. One small visit at a time." He nodded again. Didn't ask for more. Didn't try to fix it. And that too was a kind of growth. That night, I wrote in my journal, "You don't always need to scream to reclaim your place. Sometimes you just need to outlast the lie." And I closed the book knowing I had done exactly that. A few months later, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A legal envelope, stiff beige, marked with a firm I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened at the sight of it. Old reflexes, trauma echoes. But when I opened it, I nearly laughed. Emily had filed for divorce. Inside the packet was a single-page statement, a financial affidavit, and more interesting than any of it, a note handwritten in the margin of the cover letter. He said he wanted to rebuild things with his mother. I told him I wouldn't stick around to watch that happen. Bitter ink. Even in retreat, she had to land one last cut. But I didn't feel triumph, not pity, just confirmation that people like her don't change, they just reassign their targets. She didn't lose because I outmaneuvered her in court. She lost because she never understood who she was fighting. She thought I was a relic, a woman with fading memories and soft words. What she never grasped was that memory isn't weakness, it's armor, especially when it's written down. Daniel came by that evening. I didn't mention the envelope. He looked tired, exhausted in the way people get when their delusions finally run out of air. "She moved out," he said. I nodded. "Did she take anything?" "Half the furniture. Some art." My pride. That last one made me pause. "Daniel," I said, "you can't keep framing every moment of pain as a theft. Some things are just the price of waking up." He nodded slowly and for once didn't try to defend her. "I feel like I'm starting over," he said, "and I don't know where to begin." "You already did," I said. "You came back." That weekend, he brought my grandson over. Ethan was 6 now, tall for his age, with that impossibly unfiltered energy that only young children seem to carry. He had a toy robot and a backpack covered in planets. When I opened the door, he blinked at me, then held up a Lego figure. "I made this guy shoot lasers from his hands." I laughed. "Does he have a name?" "Yeah. Commander Truth." I raised an eyebrow at Daniel. He smiled sheepishly. "I may have told him a little about your courtroom win." We sat on the rug and built a Lego base together. Ethan explained the rules. Apparently, Commander Truth only zapped bad guys who told lies. A poetic little circle. He looked up at me and asked, "Did you have to go to the hospital when they said you were crazy?" Daniel froze. I looked Ethan in the eyes and said, "No, honey. I just had to tell the truth until the grown-ups listened." He nodded like that made perfect sense. That night, I stood in front of the hallway mirror and saw something new. Not just myself, but my place, my space, my home still intact, my name still mine, my mind sharper than ever, and the realization that no one could take that from me again unless I handed it to them. The next morning I called Ben. "Want to co-author a piece?" I asked. He chuckled. "On what?" "Guardianship abuse. Paper trail strategy. Things no one teaches until it's too late." He paused. "You thinking local newspaper?" "No," I said. "I'm thinking national. Retirement networks. Legal Digest columns. Anywhere women like me need to read it." "Are you ready to go public?" "I'm already public, Ben," I said. "They just don't know it yet." We started small, an op-ed titled "The Quiet War on Elder Autonomy." It caught traction. A few weeks later, I was asked to join a podcast. Then a speaking panel, a Q&A livestream. Suddenly, I wasn't just telling my story. I was holding space for others to tell theirs. Emails poured in, stories of betrayal, of legal manipulation, of daughters and sons and nieces and neighbors, all finding subtle ways to squeeze someone into a corner they couldn't get out of. It wasn't always loud, it wasn't always violent, but it was always cruel. And now it was being exposed. One message stood out. From a woman named Geraldine in Maine. She wrote, "My son forged my signature to refinance my home. When I told my lawyer, he said it wasn't worth the fight. But after reading what you wrote, I think it is." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just catharsis. It was strategy. I still lived quietly. No banners, no fanfare. Just good tea, soft light, and the rhythm of control slowly returning to every corner of my life. But once a month, I stood behind a podium, some library, some community hall, sometimes just a coffee shop gathering, and told the story again. Not for revenge, but as a map, for those still trapped inside the lies. That spring, I bought myself a gift, a new red leather journal. Embossed on the cover in gold letters were 3 simple words: "I remember everything." Because sometimes the sharpest weapon you own isn't rage, it's memory. By early summer, the journal was nearly half full. I'd written not just my memories, but the stories women had whispered into my inbox, my phone line, my ears after events. Tales that echoed mine yet wore different names. Some ended with court victories, some ended with silence. A few tragically ended too late, but all of them had one thread in common. They began with someone deciding that aging meant weakness, that quiet meant submission, that motherhood or widowhood or any perceived softness meant surrender. I knew better now, and I was no longer alone. One afternoon, I received a phone call from a producer at a local public television station. They'd read my op-ed in the State Legal Digest and asked if I'd be willing to do a short segment. "On what?" I asked. "On how women protect themselves," the producer said. "How they prepare, how they fight back, and how they survive when no one believes them." There was a pause. Then she added, "We'd like you to bring your journal." I arrived at the station a week later, wearing my navy blazer and a gold brooch that had once belonged to my mother. The lights were bright but soft, the host warm, the questions careful but deliberate. "How did it begin?" she asked. "With silence," I said, "with trust misused." "And how did it end?" I smiled. "With documentation." She leaned forward. "You're saying it's not enough to be right?" "It's never enough," I said. "You must also be prepared to prove it." After the cameras stopped rolling, one of the younger crew members approached me. "My grandmother's going through something like this," she whispered. "Do you think she should write it down too?" I nodded. "Every detail, every day. Write as if someone will one day read it to save her life." The segment aired on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had over 200 messages. Not just from women, from sons, from daughters, from attorneys who had never looked at guardianship through the lens of control instead of care. One message read, "My father always said my mother was just tired when she forgot things. But now I see what he was really doing. Thank you for opening my eyes before I became complicit." That word complicit haunted me. Because that was Daniel's role for so long. Not the abuser, but the permission. Daniel had started attending some of my events. He never sat up front, always in the back. Quiet, watchful. One evening, after I gave a talk at a retirement home in Ashbury Park, he waited by the car. I listened to every word he said. "I saw you," I replied. He hesitated, then said, "Do you think I'll ever stop being part of the story?" "No," I said. "But maybe you can help rewrite the ending." He took a deep breath. "I'd like to volunteer. For your group. Help file paperwork, answer emails. Learn the law better. Be useful." I tilted my head. "Not to redeem yourself." "No," he said. "To protect someone else before it's too late." And so he did. He sat beside me one weekend helping an 82-year-old woman scan her handwritten notes into a digital folder so her grandchildren couldn't say she'd lost things again. He read old case law highlighted in yellow. He apologized to 3 women who reminded him of me, not for show, but because growth often starts with listening over and over again, and he was finally listening. Then one morning, a certified letter arrived from Emily. I opened it slowly, carefully. Inside was a settlement agreement. She had signed over all remaining rights to Daniel's home, the one they had shared, the one partially paid for by my late husband's inheritance. No threats, no requests, just signatures, and a short handwritten sentence at the bottom. "I never understood who you were until it was too late. But now I see you everywhere." I didn't smile, but I felt something close. Not forgiveness, but closure. At our next event, I read from the journal for the first time publicly. I chose the entry I wrote the night before my court hearing. "If they doubt your mind, give them your clarity. If they doubt your worth, give them your silence until the verdict reads your name with dignity." The room applauded quietly. No whistles, no shouting. Just hands pressed together by women who had learned the cost of stillness and the value of reclaiming their voices. Later that night, I returned home and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. I sat in my favorite chair by the window, cracked open the red leather journal, and began writing again. Not about Emily, not about Daniel, about a woman named Linda in Wisconsin. A woman who had finally left her abusive son's house and taken her savings with her. A woman who said reading my story online unlocked something. I recorded it, logged her story, her details, her victory. Because now this wasn't just my journal anymore. It was our archive. And we were just getting started. I didn't set out to build a movement. I only wanted to reclaim what was mine. My name, my home, my dignity. But somewhere between the late-night journal entries and the whispered thank yous at library talks, something shifted. The women who once came to hear me began forming their own circles. Book clubs turned into strategy sessions. Coffee groups into legal resource hubs. They weren't just listening anymore. They were organizing, and my story became something bigger than personal revenge. It became precedent. One afternoon, I received a package. No return address. Just a padded envelope with my name handwritten on the front. Inside was a photograph. It showed a woman in her 60s, shoulders back, arms crossed, standing on the porch of a house she had just reclaimed from a niece who tried to evict her. Taped to the back of the photo was a note. "They told me I had no fight left. Then I remembered your story. Now I've got my house and my spine back." Underneath, in small, neat handwriting, "I remember everything." I sat with the photo in my lap for a long time. Then I added it to the album I kept on the shelf. Not a photo album of family, but of women who had taken their lives back. We called it The Ledger. The next meeting of our growing circle was held at the old Civic Center. 83 people attended. 25 of them were men, husbands, sons, nephews. A year ago, that would have surprised me, but not now. Daniel stood near the back again. This time, not in silence. He was leading a session. How to Spot Manipulation in Legal Disguises. A title I had once scrawled on a notepad in my kitchen, and now he was teaching it. Afterward, I walked up to him. "You've found your voice?" I said. He smiled, but there was no pride in it. Just quiet resolve. "You helped me see what I couldn't," before he said, "Now I just want to help others open their eyes sooner." I touched his hand. Not forgiveness, But permission? You're doing that, I said. Keep going. That week, I received an invitation. The State Bar Association was hosting its annual Elder Rights Conference. They asked me to be the keynote speaker. At first, I laughed. Do they know I'm not a lawyer? I asked Ben. He grinned. That's exactly why they want you. And so I stood on that stage under chandeliers instead of courthouse fluorescents and told a room full of attorneys, judges, and advocates. You are the gatekeepers. But you're not the authors. We are. And we will keep writing, speaking, and recording until no woman is ever declared unfit, just because she refuses to be silent. When I stepped off the stage, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a witness to what happens when one woman refuses to vanish. Not long after, I was approached by a publisher. They wanted to collect the stories from the journal My Story and the others and turn them into a book. I said yes, not because I wanted fame, but because I wanted permanence. Paper doesn't forget, not when it's written with intention, not when it's bound in truth. Daniel came by on a Sunday afternoon with Ethan. They brought daisies, my favorite. We played a board game Ethan insisted on winning, and after dinner he tugged my sleeve and said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to be someone who protects people like you do." Daniel watched me carefully. I turned to my grandson and smiled. Then remember this. The strongest people don't shout. They prepare, they wait, and when the time comes, they know exactly where the truth is written. That night, I wrote one more entry in the Red Journal. The real verdict didn't happen in court. It happened when a little boy decided that bravery could look like a quiet woman with a leather book. And beneath it, I added one last line. She tried to write me off, but I took the pen back. Then I closed the journal and looked around my home, every corner I had reclaimed, every room I had saved, every word I had finally spoken. The book launched quietly. No billboards, no bestseller lists, just a modest hardcover with a crimson spine embossed in gold. I remember everything. Stories of silent survival and the quiet return to power. It landed in libraries first, senior centers, legal clinics. Then word spread like wildfire under the radar. It became the book passed between friends at kitchen tables, between sisters at doctors' offices, between neighbors during slow walks around the block. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was instruction. And the letters kept coming. Some wrote to say thank you, some to share horrors. Others simply said, I didn't know anyone else had gone through it. Now I do. Now I believe myself. That sentence struck me every time. Now I believe myself. Because that's how it starts, isn't it? Before they try to convince the court you're unfit, they convince you that you might be. And self-doubt is the easiest prison to escape until you forget the door was ever open. One letter came with a photocopy of an amended will. A woman named Roberta in Florida had removed her son from the executor role after reading my chapter on guardianship gaslighting. She wrote, "He called me paranoid for asking questions. But after your book, I realized he just didn't want me looking too closely." These women were not bitter. They were awake. And awakening, I've found, is the most dangerous form of peace. The movement began to take on a name. The Ledger Women, not coined by me, by them. Because the Red Journal had become more than a personal artifact. It became a blueprint copied, downloaded, adapted. In retirement communities across the country, women were beginning to keep ledger logs, not just for their protection, but for their clarity. Some even read their journals aloud in community meetings, not as confessions, but as declarations. I was invited to Washington, D.C., 6 months after the book was published. An advocacy group had arranged a roundtable with lawmakers on the rise in guardianship abuse. They asked me to attend, not as an expert, but as evidence. Ben came too. He wore the same Navy suit. I brought the Red Journal, and when the congressional aide asked me what advice I had for their upcoming elder rights bill, I gave them a sentence I'd written months ago, but never spoken aloud. You cannot legislate compassion, but you can remove the tools abusers use to masquerade it. The room went quiet. Then the aide, young, clean-shaven, clearly unaccustomed to gray-haired women speaking like that, said, "We'll put that in the notes." Ben leaned over and whispered, "You should run for office." I chuckled. I already have more power than most of them. I have paper. And people? Daniel continued to volunteer. He and Ethan would often arrive early to help set up folding chairs, print handouts, carry coffee carafes. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional meeting where a woman shared how her daughter tried to convince her doctor she had dementia to access her pension, Daniel found me in the hallway. "Does it ever get easier to hear?" "No," I said. "But it gets easier to believe." He looked out the window for a long moment, then said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I did give up," I said. "But I never gave up on the version of you I believed could return." That evening, he brought Ethan to stay the night. It was the first time in over 3 years. I made cocoa. He brought his sketchbook. And when I tucked him into bed, he looked up and whispered, "Grandma, can you tell me one of your secrets?" I smiled. "I'll tell you the biggest one." He leaned in, eyes wide. "It's this. The people who are quiet the longest usually remember the most. And remembering is the strongest kind of power." After he drifted off, I returned to my desk, opened the journal, and wrote. They tried to erase me with paperwork, but I wrote back with proof. And that night, I slept deeper than I had in years. Because for the first time, I wasn't just defending myself. I was arming an army of grandmothers, of aunts, of neighbors, of women who had been told they were too fragile, too old, too late, and who now finally were remembering everything, together. That fall, I was invited to speak at a university of all places. A social policy course had adopted "I Remember Everything" as part of their curriculum on elder rights, and the professor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Renee Kalin, asked if I would come speak to her class of graduate students. At first, I hesitated. Most of my talks were with people my age or older women who had lived the battle. But then I realized something. These young people would soon be social workers, policymakers, elder care specialists. They were the future hands holding our stories. Better to make sure those hands weren't afraid to grip the truth. So I said yes. The lecture hall was filled with young faces and laptop screens. Many looked like they'd barely been out of college, let alone face the crushing complexity of aging systems. I stood at the front in my signature blazer. No notes. Just the journal now full in my hand. "I'm not here to give you theories," I said. "I'm here to give you what the system forgets. Names, dates, voices." Then I opened the journal to one of the older entries. October 11th. She called the doctor and told him I'd started losing time. The doctor never called me. He called her back. That's how erasure begins, not in the courtroom, but in the space where no one asks you for your version. A few students stopped typing. They looked up. Good. Afterward, they surrounded me with questions. Real ones. What would you change in how we train caregivers? How can we tell the difference between concern and control? Is documenting everything enough? And then one young woman asked, "What do we say to someone who's been silenced?" I looked her in the eyes and said, "You say, 'I believe you and I'm here for the long version.'" Because the truth rarely fits in a form. The room went still. Then applause, soft but sustained. I left that day with something I hadn't expected. Hope. Back at home, I started planning something bigger. Not just monthly meetings, not just scattered essays. A conference. The first National Ledger Gathering. We booked an old hotel in upstate New York. Small, rustic, filled with fireplaces and wide porches. We weren't trying to be fancy, just safe. Just together. Word spread faster than we expected. By the time we closed registration, over 300 women had signed up. We weren't a whisper anymore. We were a movement. Daniel helped with logistics. He was good at organizing now. Efficient. Quietly respectful. He didn't speak for me. He listened for me. At the gathering, he ran the registration table. "Welcome to the ledger," he said with a smile to each woman. "She's waiting inside." And I was at the front of the main hall under a banner that read, "We outlived the lies." The opening ceremony was unlike anything I'd experienced. No music, no speeches. Just each woman as she entered placing a red ribbon on a wall-sized journal canvas. Some had their names stitched on it. Some had stories. One simply wrote, "They called me crazy. I called my lawyer. By the end of the evening, the journal wall was full, and so were we, full of stories, survival solidarity. I spoke last. My name is Margaret Harrow, I began like always. And once someone I loved tried to have me declared mentally unfit. Heads nodded. But now I stand in a room full of women who've been called too much, too little too late, and who are still here, still whole, still documenting. Laughter soft and sharp rippled through the room. And to those who still whisper, she's overreacting, we say, good, because reaction means we noticed, and noticing is how freedom begins. That night, as women shared tea and stories and quiet laughter by the fireside, I stood at the edge of the porch with Helen. You started this, she said. I shook my head. No, Emily started it. I just made sure she didn't get the last word. Helen chuckled. Is that going in the next book? I think so. And then, out of nowhere, she said something that took my breath. You know, Maggie, I think you didn't just survive her lie. You made it irrelevant. That word hit deep. Irrelevant. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's living so fully that the betrayal becomes a footnote in your life, no longer the headline. That night, I added one more entry to a fresh leather-bound journal. She said I was losing time. But look at me now, owning every second. A few months after the conference, I received a phone call that made me pause mid-step on my porch. It was from the State Judiciary Committee. They wanted me to serve as a public advisor on a special task force, one focused on reforming guardianship laws and increasing oversight in elder competency assessments. I stood there holding the phone birdsong drifting through the late afternoon air and realized this wasn't just recognition. This was access. This was what people like Emily never anticipated. That the woman they tried to silence would be asked to speak in rooms they would never enter. At our first task force meeting, I sat at the far end of the long table. Suits on both sides, some faces curious, others tight with quiet resistance. I was the only one with white hair. The only one with a journal on the table instead of a tablet. One of the younger lawyers, clearly skeptical, leaned over during break and asked, "What qualifies you to be here?" I turned to him not unkindly and said, "I survived the law being used on me instead of for me. That's more qualification than most ever get." He didn't speak again. The proposals we worked on weren't glamorous. They were practical, quiet, just like us. Mandatory second evaluations for all mental competency claims. Recorded interviews during family-led petitions. Court-funded access to legal counsel for elderly respondents. Digital paper trails required for all transfers of property during contested guardianship cases. Small things. But as I had learned, small things can change the entire ending. Meanwhile, I remember everything reached its second printing. The publisher asked if I wanted to revise the introduction. I declined. It should stay as it was when I still had something to prove, I told them. Let the story remain rooted in the raw. But I agreed to add a final chapter. It was titled, "What Happens After the Verdict?" And in it I wrote, "You return home. You make tea. You breathe. You sit in the very chair they tried to steal from you, and remember, they tried to take your name, your mind, your place. But you never left. You were just waiting for the silence to end." That fall, something remarkable happened. A woman named Jeanette, whom I'd only met once at the Ledger conference, announced she was launching a local memory bank, a place where women could log their experiences, not to publish them, not to dramatize them, just to document and store them in safe legal formats. Other women followed. By year's end, there were over 20 memory banks across the country. Each one started with a red folder and a promise: I will not vanish quietly. Daniel, meanwhile, had transformed. He wasn't just volunteering anymore. He was studying. He had enrolled in a part-time elder law program. Told me he wanted to help other men see how control can wear the costume of care. He showed me his first paper. When Loyalty Becomes Complicity. Sons in the Middle of Elder Power Abuse. I cried reading it. Not because he had changed, but because he had chosen to. One morning, I woke up early and went to my garden. The roses I had neglected during the court case had returned in full bloom. Persistent, unapologetic. I clipped 3 of them, set them in a vase by my front window. Then I opened a fresh journal. This one was blue, not because the red had lost its meaning, but because now the fight had changed color. It wasn't about fire anymore. It was about clarity. That day, I wrote, "She thought taking me to court was the end of the story. But some endings bloom again, and again, and again. And beneath that, I don't write to be heard. I write so they never forget." Letters kept coming, calls, photos, folded pages with penciled truths. And I kept filing them. Because the truth is, when someone tries to make your life small, the best revenge is to leave behind a record too large to ignore. It was a rainy Thursday when I received the most unexpected call yet. PBS was producing a documentary on elder empowerment, and they wanted to include a segment on the Ledger women. "Would you be willing to be interviewed?" the producer asked. "We'd like to film in your home, show the journals, let the audience feel the movement from the inside out." My first instinct was to say no. My life had always been private, quiet, purposefully invisible. But then I thought of all the women who had written to me, who had sat at my kitchen table trembling as they shared stories no one else had believed. If I could be seen, if I chose to be seen, maybe it would make it safer for them to speak too. So I said yes. 2 weeks later, a small crew arrived. No boom mics or glaring lights. Just soft cameras, soft shoes, soft voices asking real questions. They filmed the journals lined neatly on my bookshelf. The scarlet one, the navy one, the blue one I'd only just started. They filmed the framed photo of Ethan and me on the porch, arms around each other, both of us grinning wide. They filmed the old red folder, the one Emily had tried to replace with power of attorney paperwork, now empty, symbolic. And then they filmed me, sitting in my favorite chair, telling the story again, not for shock, not for pity, but as instruction. The interviewer asked a question no one had asked before. "If Emily were watching this, what would you want her to hear?" I paused, not out of hesitation, but out of precision. Then I said, "That she taught me something. She taught me how vulnerable silence is. She taught me that kindness without boundaries is a liability. And she reminded me painfully that being right doesn't matter if you don't have proof. So thank you, Emily. You almost destroyed me, but instead you clarified me." There was a pause behind the camera. Then a whispered, "Damn." I smiled. "You can bleep that, right?" They laughed. I didn't. When the documentary aired, it wasn't a primetime event. It was a late-night segment buried between antique appraisal reruns and historical biographies. But it exploded online. Clips circulated. Quotes turned into graphics. I remember everything trended for the first time. And with it came a flood of new women, younger ones. Women in their 40s and 50s who had seen the writing on the wall and wanted to get ahead of the danger. That to me was the most powerful shift of all. Because prevention is the final evolution of survival. Daniel called that night. "Mom," he said, "you were incredible." I was honest. "Same thing." I chuckled. "Not always." He asked if I was okay if it had been too much. It wasn't easy, I admitted. But the hard things are often where the truth gets its sharpest edges. A week later, I received a package in the mail. No note. Just a box filled with empty red journals. A subtle nod from the publisher. They were letting me choose who to send them to. And I did. Each journal went out with a handwritten card. Just one sentence. "This is not a diary. This is your defense." At our next Ledger Women gathering, something remarkable happened. We held a ceremony, not for grief, but for reclamation. Each woman stood and named what had been taken from her and what she had taken back. One said, "They took my home. I took back my boundaries." Another, "They took my name. I took back my legacy." One woman, barely audible, whispered, "They took my trust. I took back my daughter." And then it was my turn. I stood, looked out at the room that had grown from 4 women in a coffee shop to hundreds, in folding chairs with fire in their eyes. And I said, "They took my mind on paper. I took back my voice in ink." Afterward, a woman approached me. Her hair was silver at the roots, dyed auburn at the tips. She had the look of someone who had survived the long version of something cruel. She handed me her journal. "I don't want to carry this alone anymore," she said. "Would you read it?" I took it, heavy, handwritten, tender. And I said what I wish someone had said to me all those years ago. "Yes, I will read it, because your silence deserves a witness, and your truth deserves a record." As winter approached, the calls slowed, the emails trickled, and for the first time in many months, I found myself in stillness. But this wasn't the silence of being forgotten. It was the quiet of momentum, the silence of something already moving even when I wasn't the one pushing it forward. The ledger women had grown beyond me. New chapters opened in cities I'd never visited. Workshops appeared without my prompting. Younger voices began speaking on behalf of their elders, equipped with journals, templates, timelines, some of which I had never written. That was the moment I knew. I had become the spark, not the flame, and I was at peace with that. One morning, as the frost clung to the edges of the window, I received a letter that made me pause. It was from Emily. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce. There was no return address, just a single page of thin cream paper carefully folded. I hesitated, unsure if I should open it, but of course I did. Inside, "I watched the documentary. I didn't recognize you at first. You looked calm, strong, unreachable. I don't know if I was ever capable of seeing you without seeing what you had, what I thought I needed. But I do know now. I didn't win, and I never will. You're not who I thought you were. You're much more." That was it. No apology, no redemption arc, just acknowledgement. The final line caught me off guard, not because of what it said, but because I didn't need it. I didn't need her validation. I had already outlived her fiction. That night, I added one last entry to the blue journal. "When they rewrite you, you must choose whether to vanish or reappear in bolder ink." And under it, I chose ink. I chose pages. I chose the ledger. Then I closed the book and tucked it next to the others on the shelf. The holidays came with their usual noise. Daniel brought Ethan, now a head taller, full of questions about the world and the past, and the weird things grown-ups do to each other. He asked Grandma, "Do you still write down everything?" I smiled. "Not everything, just the things I want remembered." He considered that. "Will you write about me?" "I already have," I said. He leaned in. "Can I see it?" "Someday," I said softly. "When you're old enough to understand that silence isn't weakness and that truth takes time." He nodded, then asked, "Can I start a journal too?" And there it was. The victory. Not in courtrooms. Not in documentaries. Not even in the national laws that now bore my fingerprints. But in a boy who wanted to remember, because someone had taught him that stories matter. On New Year's Eve, as the neighborhood fireworks cracked in the distance, I stood by the window alone, tea cooling in my hand, a single candle flickering on the sill. I looked around my living room, this quiet battlefield where I had once read court papers with trembling hands, now filled with flowers, photos, laughter. Reclaimed. I whispered into the dark. She thought she could end me. All she did was write my beginning. And then I let the past settle like dust. Not erased, just shelved. At midnight, I opened one final journal, fresh, dark green, the color of legacy. Inside I wrote, "This ledger doesn't begin in pain. It begins in memory. It begins with power already restored." I put down the pen, turned out the light, and began the next chapter, not as a woman recovering from betrayal, but as one building a world where no woman needs to defend her worth again. Spring arrived slowly that year. The kind of spring you barely notice until the light begins to stay longer. The breeze grows softer, and the birds start singing before you've had your first sip of morning tea. I woke up one Sunday and realized the weight in my chest, the one that had settled there ever since Emily's petition was gone, not lifted suddenly, but worn down, dissolved over time by every act of reclaiming. I no longer checked the locks twice, no longer reread letters searching for hidden threats, no longer wondered whether my voice would be heard, because it had been, again, and again, and again. Daniel and Ethan came over for brunch that morning. Daniel made omelets, Ethan brought a drawing crayon on thick paper. It showed a house, a big oak tree, a woman sitting at a desk writing. In large, slightly wobbly letters, he had titled it, "Grandma Saves People." I smiled. "Who are the people I saved?" I asked. He shrugged. "Everyone who listens." That afternoon, I tucked the drawing into the back of the green journal. Later that week, I received a letter from a small town in Utah. A woman named Rose. She was 81. Her story, almost identical to mine. A niece who tried to declare her unfit. A petition. A quiet lawyer. A journal. And a victory. She ended her letter with a sentence that stayed with me for days. "The world will always underestimate older women until we give them records they can't ignore." She was right. We were not what they expected. We were not soft victims waiting to be saved. We were witnesses. We were archivists. We were chroniclers of truth. And now we were many. At our final ledger gathering of the year, I stood at the front once more, this time joined by 12 other women who had started chapters in their own cities. I no longer had to carry the room. It carried itself. Each woman shared one sentence from her journal, a single truth she had written and survived. Then we lit candles, small white tapers set into hand-thrown clay holders. And when it was my turn, I said only this: "The most dangerous thing I ever did was tell the truth on paper. And the most powerful thing, I never stopped." That night, I stayed behind to clean up. Helen sat with me folding programs and humming softly. At one point, she looked up and said, "You know, you never got your apology." I nodded. "No, but I got my voice back. And I gave others theirs." She smiled. "That's worth more." Then she asked, "Will you ever stop writing?" I looked at the empty journal in my lap, the next one in line, already calling. "No," I said. "Because every time one woman forgets herself, another has to remember her out loud." And that's what the ledger had become. A way to remember each other. A way to outlive the lies. At home, I lit a single candle by the window and opened the green journal again. On its first page, I wrote the last line of my story. She tried to bury me with paper, but I rose with pen in hand. I closed the book, set it on the shelf next to the others, then turned toward the window where the moon sat full and round above my house. My name still on the deed, my life still my own. And I exhaled, not in exhaustion, but in completion. Because I am Margaret Harrow, and I remember everything. There's something quietly radical about an older woman holding a pen. We live in a world that assumes our stories end after a certain age, that once the children are grown, the spouse is buried, and the hair turns white, we become background characters in our own lives. But I learned something no courtroom can erase. A woman who documents her truth is a woman no one can silence. I didn't start the ledger to make noise. I started it to survive, but survival turned into voice. Voice turned into connection. And connection became a movement. Across the country, in quiet rooms and humble kitchens, women are writing. They're logging conversations, naming betrayals, indexing kindnesses, noting red flags. They're keeping journals not of bitterness, but of memory. Because memory is the most subversive tool we have. It doesn't demand justice. It records it. And now we are many. The ledger women no longer wait for someone to hand us power. We document our value. We catalog our harm. We publish our resistance. And most importantly, we leave a record behind. For the next generation. For the women who aren't ready yet. For the men who still don't believe us. For the lawmakers who now listen because we made them. So if you're reading this and someone is trying to make you small, start writing. Even if it's just one line. Even if it's just your name. Especially if they've tried to take it. Because in the end, they didn't erase me. They made me unforgettable. And the only thing more powerful than a silenced woman is a silenced woman who writes everything down.